Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, collectors of all ages, welcome back to Aussieverse, the channel where we explore comics, pop culture, and the people who helped shape the stories that we love. Today's guest is someone who's been behind the scenes of some of the most iconic moments in modern comics history. He's a former Marvel Comics editor, having worked during a pivotal era for the company, helping guide characters that have since become global cultural icons. He's also an accomplished author and historian, writing extensively about comics, not just as entertainment, but as a serious art form and cultural force. So whether you grew up reading Marvel, love digging into how stories are made, or you're just fascinated by how the culture evolves over time, this is something you don't want to miss. Please welcome to Aussieverse, the legend himself, Mr. Danny Fingeroth.
Thank you, Bo. And you can quit with the fake Australian accent. I know you're really in Brooklyn, so nobody's going to believe that accent. It sounds too phony to be real. So just come clean and tell people where you're really from.
Faking an Australian accent is quite hard.
I couldn't do it. I'd do some kind of what was that? One of those movies that were popular in the 80s.
All the muscle movies, I think, were all
popular.
The
Crocodile Dundee. That was it. I would just sound like a bad imitation of Crocodile Dundee. Those were quite popular. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be here. We seem to have gotten past our technical difficulties due to my ancient Macintosh, which I really thought I had prepped and gotten ready, but here we are. So.
It only matters the end result.
That's it, and we're here. So what mysteries and hidden secrets can I reveal?
Well, let's see. It depends on how much time you've got, because I have broken this down into a few different categories. The first thing I do have to say, though, Danny, is I went and I recently purchased one of your books here.
That's the latest one.
But I completely forgot that I owned this book that you did so long ago that I read and really, really enjoyed.
Thank you.
I just couldn't believe that I already owned one of your books. I mentioned to you when I reached out to come on the show that as ridiculous as it may sound, the reason why you always got my attention in the comics first and foremost is because my surname is Roth. So when I was a child and I would see your name in the comic, it would always stand out to me. And obviously Fingeroth is something that you can imagine as a child. You're like, wow, that's an interesting variation of my own surname. And it was every comic, every single comic. Your name was just there over and over and over again, and I never forgot about you.
Well, I guess my ancestors in the Pale of Settlement must have known that 150 years later they would be helping me with branding in America. The name, as far as I can tell, it's from the Yiddish Fingeroth, which really means thimble. I mean, that, although I never really did any serious research, but so you see variations. I don't know if in Australia, but in America, and I see Fingered and Fingerhut and Fingeroth. So far, anybody who spells it the way I do is generally related to me. There's only one. I only came across one guy many years ago who claimed he wasn't, but I think he was lying, so but it's fun, and I suppose, are you a Jewish background, or?
Yeah. So my original name was Rothstein, which was, I believe,
Redstone. Okay. Yeah, Redstone. Well, like Sumner Redstone, So no, really. So they, right. So I guess that's one way of shortening it, or one thing that it would have been originally Roth as much. Because I always wondered what life would have been like had I had like a more concise easier to pronounce version of the name, like or even Finger, But
Yeah.
I don't, as far as I know, I'm not related to Bill Finger or anybody like that. But again, I've never done any DNA testing or genealogy testing. But it's you know because I went to school. I'm from a deep Jewish American New York City background. I'm a total cliche, right? I'm a native born Manhattanite, lived here all my life, and I worked in media. I mean, how much more of a cliche can you be? But I'm in good company with Stanley and some other people. Um, but I always wondered if my name was something like, well, maybe not Bo. I think the Bo is, but say like Steve Roth or Bill Stern. Something that was still possibly Jewish, but not. And I went, I guess children. I can see what you can see. We're really getting to the hard hitting topic. Your name could be, Joe Smith, and children in elementary school will find a way to make fun of your name, right? I mean,
Oh yeah.
that's the genius of childhood. So, I mean, I went to school with a lot of kids with funny, hard to pronounce names, and I think I mostly remember affectionate nicknames like Fingy or the Fing or you both in summer camp and school and in the comics business. That was my uh, it wasn't my alliterative Marvel nickname, but around the office I was generally referred to as the Thing.
Oh, okay.
It
Okay, mate.
sort of sounds like the Thing, so it's appropriate for Marvel. Anyway, nice to meet you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Danny. Before we do get into all the questions, I do just want to give a quick shout out to our four lifers. These are the people that do spend $1 or $2 every single month and contribute to Aussieverse. Thank you oh so much to these people. We really, really appreciate all the contributions. And as usual, we are sponsored by Comic Bookaroo, Australia's #1 online comic book store. Enough of the plug-in. Let's get down to some loving, Danny.
Okay.
For viewers who may not know your full background, how did you first break into comics, and what pulled you towards Marvel specifically?
Wow. Well, um, I loved comics. You know, it's so hard to not digress. Okay, I always loved comics. Probably starting with newspaper comics, which were ubiquitous when I was a kid. Um, and so in New York, we had multiple newspapers with daily comics and then color comics on the weekend. And so I was attracted to the medium in ways, excuse me, that I didn't even think about it. Because not everybody can read comics. A lot of people don't even know. A lot of very smart people can't figure out how to read comic strips or comic books. Then I then I was a big fan of the Popeye the Sailor cartoons that were on TV when I was a kid, and that's my first comic book memory is my mother buying me a Popeye the Sailor comics. Then I had a cousin who was into it. So somehow they were always there. I had older brothers who were not especially. I think like a lot of people, they read comics for a year or two, and then so I was reading, and then there's something about the superhero fantasy. I wasn't interested in, particularly in Western comics. I like some humor comics. It was like Sad Sack and Archie.
Oh,
But
sad
the
sack.
thing that really got to me were Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Green Lantern was great because all you needed was some kind of ring to pretend to be Green Lantern.
Yeah.
So those DC Comics characters, and then I had like two or three friends in 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 um, in school. I was a student at a yeshiva, a Jewish day school, but also had secular studies. I had two or three friends who were. I'm trying to place. I was not on the affluent side of the area, but I grew up, near the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Say, if you want to try to place geographically where I grew up. Um, so I had a few friends, and one of these who were into comics in my yeshiva, and one of them said, "There's this new thing called Fantastic Four. I think you'd like it." And so I went to the local candy store, which is what we call the combination of a soda shop and magazine store, and they sold candy as well, and cigarettes, cigars. And they had a big comic book display, and I bought the Fantastic Four. It was, or
Number
maybe it
one?
was, number four. I got in late. It was the Return of the Submariner,
Yeah, okay.
and I think I'd actually, without knowing it, I'd been reading what were later called Marvel Comics, but at that point had no brand name at all. They were generic comics.
Okay.
They were distinguished by not having a company name on the cover.
Interesting.
Um, but I think I've been reading in the barber shop. I've been reading Millie the Model, which makes sense, right? If some kid's parents tell them you got to get rid of those lousy comic books, the ones they're going to give away, uh, if you're a boy, probably a Millie the Model. But Millie the Model was full of that witty Stanley dialogue, and it had that look and feel that I later associated with. So Fantastic Four #4 was the first thing that I was aware of as being this other company, this Fantastic Four company, and it blew my mind. It although I'd been reading, religiously Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Flash, Justice League of America, there was something about the look and feel. It was Stanley and Jack Kirby, and how they were approaching comics. And there was something about that story of the Submariner returning. As a comic fan, even at age, I guess I was 8, 9 years old, there was something about the fact that there was a past, that the Submariner character had a history that intrigued me, even though there was no reason for it to, but something about the way Stan and Jack presented it. That happened later when they brought back Captain America. When Captain America returned, they teased it first with a Captain America imposter fighting the Human Torch, an issue of Strange Tales. And somehow, even though I'd never before heard of Captain America, Stan Lee was so good at creating hype and knew what would appeal to an 8, 9, 10-year-old that I knew that Captain America returning was such a big deal that when Avengers #4 came out, with the return of Captain America, when first gets defrosted from the iceberg, I bought 3 copies. That's right. I invested 36 cents. So I'd have, just to be sure that I would never be without that comic.
Wow.
So that was how it started, and then I found myself as a Marvel guy giving up the DC because I wasn't made out of money. I couldn't buy the Marvels and the DCs. That would have been like $3 a month. Who could afford that? So, and then stuff happens, in one's comic reading and in one's pop culture consuming life. I got to be a teenager around the time that Jack Kirby left Marvel and went to DC, and so I followed Kirby, and I pretty much stopped reading Marvel and got into underground comics and movies, and I was busy with school and friends. So I was a big fan, especially of Harvey Picar's American Splendor.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Which came out debuted in '76. So there were probably 5 or 6 years where I was hardly reading comics at all, and I was studying filmmaking at a school in upstate New York, and it was the same program, although he'd gone there earlier, that Art Spiegelman went to, studying with a guy named Ken Jacobs, who was an underground filmmaker and a brilliant teacher, and weirdly enough, a director named Nicholas Ray had taught there, the director of Rebel Without a Cause. Although I didn't actually study with him, but he was an intense presence. So I was into film, and I got my film degree, and like a lot of young people do, I went back home, to figure out what I was going to do, and I had no idea. I didn't think I wanted to move to Hollywood. I wasn't interested in pursuing that. I know I want to do something with visual art. I'm looking back now and putting like a rational narrative on it. At the time, it was like, what am I going to do? Oh my God! You know, now I can, like, in retrospect, go, well, my carefully thought out plan. You know,
Yeah.
so I went home, which was Manhattan, where I grew up, and I had to find a job and figure out what to do. And I thought, oh, it might be fun. I kind of knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody at, you know, at Marvel. I knew I had enough of a connection to get in the door for an informational tour, and I thought, gee, it might be fun to work at Marvel Comics for a few months, you know, even though I hadn't really followed the comics for years. And so I went on this informational tour, and you know, I remember meeting Archie Goodwin and John Romita Sr. and everybody. They couldn't have been nicer. And
Wow.
I could figuratively, if not literally, hear my resumes landing in the garbage can as I left their offices. It was, you know, but you know, but then I ran into somebody I went to high school with who was working there, who like 6 months or a year later told me that there was a job opening in the British department,
Oh.
working. Um, if you know your comics history, Stan Lee's kid brother, Larry Lieber, had you know, co-creator of Iron Man, Thor, Ant Man, Groot. He had gone over to work for their cousin Martin Goodman at Martin's new company,
Mhm.
uh, Atlas Comics, and that had just folded. So Larry came back to Marvel, and he was running what was called the British department. It's mostly reprint books put out to compete with black and white weekly anthology comic magazines in England. And so most of what we do was reprints with new covers. We break up the stories into smaller chapters, put in new splash pages, and then we change color to color and elevator to lift. And, you know, because we wanted to fool people into thinking we were, we were really British. And we put out some new material with a character called Captain Britain, who then became mainstreamed. Um, Oddly, and so that was my first job at Marvel, and obviously it lasted much more than a few months. Weirdly enough, just to sort of cut to the present, my first job was as Larry Lieber's assistant. I've gone through all these other things, and you know, all these editorial positions at different companies and books. And however, Larry, at age 94, has just written his first prose novel, and I've been helping him get it published and promoted. So,
Wow.
so the joke or the irony is I started my career in 1977 as Larry Lieber's assistant, and today I am Larry Lieber's assistant. You know,
That's fantastic.
so, so anyway, so that's you know, so I started there in this department that was sort of looked down on by the mainstream editor. I mean, most people didn't give a damn, but there were, you know, one or two people who, you know, somehow felt it was necessary to let us know that we were second class citizens. Um, you know, go figure. Weird personalities in the comic book business. Who would have thought?
Who would
Uh,
have thought?
so I kind of then had a bunch of then a guy named Des Skin, if you know his name.
No.
He, he was a packager and publisher in Britain, uh,
Okay.
and he was best known, I guess, for Warrior magazine. He started that
Oh, okay.
in the late '70s, early '80s. Des convinced Marvel that perhaps if you're putting out comics for consumption by the British public, perhaps actual British people should be putting them out, and not a bunch of guys from, you know, the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Manhattan.
Sure.
So they moved, and that's where a lot of people like Alan Moore and Steve Moore and Paul Neary and a whole bunch of people got their start working for Marvel UK. Um, and so they did transfer that operation. At that point, Larry then went over to be drawing the Hulk newspaper strip that Stan was writing, and I
Mhm.
was sort of a general assistant. And I was working on Star Wars a lot because we were using Star Wars faster in England than they were in America. It's far too boring a story, but and then eventually I became Louise Jones, who you may know as Louise Simonson. I became her assistant, and then continued on moving. You know, the way one does at a job. If you
Yep.
do reasonably good work, they will promote you, and then eventually I got the Spider-Man titles in the '80s. Then I went freelance for several years. Then I got the Spider-Man titles again in the 90s, and along the way, I wrote the Darkhawk series, the Dazzler series, and Deadly Foes and Lethal Foes of Spider-Man, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Anyway, that was my comics career in a nutshell. But I'm sure we can delve a little deeper if you want.
Oh, mate, there's a lot that I want to ask you. Don't worry, but we'll just see how we go with time. But one of our comments in the chat from Matt, he says that Silver Age Marvel was definitely a new kind of comic universe, full of multifaceted characters and a different creative way of telling stories. I wasn't born until '83, but I love the Marvel Silver Age. You and me both.
Well, that's
You and
one of
me.
the great things about comics is you know it's I mean, right, all culture has a past, but there's something about comics where you read a story, if you're the right kind of person, right? You read a Superman story, and then you go, "Oh man, but this character was created 80 years ago. I got a lot to catch up." Now, some people might go, "Oh, too much. I can't deal with it." But for some people, like you and me, for instance, it's like, "Whoa, what was Superman doing in 1930?" I mean, the funny thing for me is you know, I had older parents, and so my father was an adult in 1938, and I always used to wonder, why didn't you buy half a dozen copies of Action Comics #1? I don't think that was the main thing on my father's agenda in 1938.
Yeah, yeah. My father realized back in the '90s, around the death of Superman era, how much he could have made if he'd bought certain comic growing
Well,
up.
yeah, that's we
So when I
all
was a kid, he went to the comic store and bought every single #1 that he could, and that's how I got into comics, not realizing that it was the '90s and
yeah,
everything was a #1 and printed a million times. But
but I
still,
guess, I think some of that stuff. I mean, look, if maybe for your grandchildren or something, by the time in another 30 years, that even with a million copies, probably there's probably some of that stuff that's valuable, or if it's
yeah,
autographed or whatever.
that's
Uh,
true.
Todd McFarlane autographed an issue of Spawn, even though there's a million copies, probably still adds some value to it.
Yeah. Well, you did work at Marvel during what I would assume is a very highly influential period. What did a typical day as an editor actually look like for you?
It's
Was there a typical day?
there kind of was. We used to say it beats having a real job, but I mean, it was a real job in the sense that as an editor, and everybody has, sort of fulfills that role in a different way, and you have a different chemistry with every creative team. You spend your day, having conversations with writers and artists about storylines, then going through, actual plots and actual scripts, um, and dealing with issues relating to plot and dialogue or artwork or um, so you spend a lot of time in your head and then in other
Mhm.
people's heads, and especially with a character, with a corporately owned character like a Spider-Man, you're always, aside from the creative part, you're thinking, does this fit with the character's continuity? Is this something that's appropriate, for whatever reason for Marvel to put out?
Mhm.
How does it interact with the rest of the Marvel universe? And then you can get, oh, is it an interesting story? Is it fun? Is there action? Is there something great for the artist to draw? Is there, so I think the closest thing you have, say, in TV is to a showrunner. It's kind of what a comic book editor does. You have all these moving parts, and everything comes back to you. There's a plot that's generated either from you or from a writer or maybe from some overall crossover or from wherever the plot comes from, it usually starts as a sentence or a paragraph, and then there are various ways you expand it into an outline and then a script, and so it's it's not brain surgery, but it's not nothing either. I mean,
Yeah.
it's and you are dealing not you're not dealing with robots. You're dealing with human beings who feel passionate. If you're lucky, right? I mean, who feel passionately about their work. So, and I would say editors, there are exceptions, but sort of as an editor, you owe it to your freelance staff to be honest and compassionate. So it requires you to have really good social skills and to not be afraid to confront people in a hopefully positive way with something that may be problematic.
Mm.
However, the very nature of people who go into comic book editing often have very lacking social skills, and I include myself. It took me years to develop a certain kind of skill set. And to this day, there are people who think I'm the worst editor they ever had. There are people who think I'm the best editor they ever had. I'm the same guy. So a lot of it is just chemistry,
Yeah.
but learning that is so hard, and learning to, I mean, that the funny thing about comics, it's one of those businesses like medicine where people start so young that their mistakes are made in public. um, so I mean, and yet you never know when somebody 20 years later is gonna, you never know when something you poured your heart and soul into is just going to be ignored in the marketplace. And you never know when something that you hacked out overnight to meet a deadline and get a paycheck, that somebody will come to you 20 years later and say it changed their life. There is no way to predict, you know, what, what's perceived of what you're putting on the page. And so a typical day is just juggling, you know, the good news and the bad news. And one of my favorite quotes of all time is from Roy Thomas, the guy who's writer and editor who succeeded Stan Lee as Marvel editor in chief. Roy, I'm sure he said more than once, but I remember him saying, with most of the decisions you have to make as an editor, not all, but with most, it's less important what decision gets made than that a decision gets made.
Mm.
So,
Okay.
and I guess that was the hallmark of being a comic book editor, is you probably had to make 100 decisions a day, and most of them are not that important. They're it's literally not brain surgery. So I mean, if the Amazing Spider-Man logo is red with a black drop shadow or white with a blue drop shadow, in some way it might affect sales one way or the other, or how visible, you know. Um, and then there are some other more important decisions, like who's going to write the book, who's going to draw the book. But very often, when you're dealing with such a volume of material, and you sort of, again, with something like Spider-Man, you have a certain baseline of what the character is and who the character is. Um, so that can be daunting, but also liberating.
Mm.
Because if you have 100 decisions to make, you cannot get hung up on like dithering about one decision. Because
Yeah.
there's 99 more waiting for you. And most of them are, what color should the logo be? But once in a while, it's should Aunt May live or die? Well, that's a bigger decision. You know?
Oh, I can't imagine the pressure that some of these decisions may have. I'm also a big wrestling fan, so like I can imagine, like every single, well, in your case, month, if with the one title that is, but it's like every single week you need to be making decisions that are either going to be making everybody really happy or really annoying a lot of people. And sometimes you want to annoy them for a
Right.
certain reason as well.
Well,
So it's pressure.
it's probably like wrestling. I always thought our job was to was to irritate our audience enough so they had to come back every month to see just how he was screwing up, you know. Because if you, I mean, that's a problem that a lot of comics have. Um, that you know, every month they have competently written and competently drawn stories, but I mean, look, eventually it almost got absurd, you know, where you have what I call stunt programming. You know, I mean, right? There were periods when you could skip a year of a comic and not know the difference,
Mm.
um, which tends, you know, to lose anything but your most hardcore readers. You know, you know, I always felt it was in some way our job to bring readers to the edge of leaving a series, um, but not so over the edge that they leave, and it's tricky, you know. But there is that danger of complacency, you know, where it's like, oh well, I don't, you know, I'm a little short on cash this month. I don't have to buy, you know. That was all, and we tried, right? We had 4 Spider-Man titles, Amazing, Web, Spectacular, and then the one with the shortest name had the longest nickname. The one that was just called Spider-Man, we referred to in the office as the adjectiveless Spider-Man.
Yes.
So, you know, we tried to make it so that Amazing, you know, right? Everybody just sort of said, "Oh, Amazing Spider-Man, that's the one that's been around the longest. It's the flagship. It usually has the most glamorous art and writing team. Not always, but we tried to make it so that that was not the default. Although somehow it often ended up that way. You know, we tried to make them all important. You know, so it's kind of my, you know, my job to make it so that all of them were equally important. Um, so it was interesting. You know, it was, you know, every um, the Clone Saga enters the chat.
Yeah,
You know,
this is
how could
a
it not?
friend of mine that knows the Clone Saga is like my favorite thing of all time. Like I've even got Ben Riley's tattoo on my arm.
I
Like,
saw your icon on Facebook is the Ben Riley costume, which
yeah,
which I mean, there are not a lot of things in Marvel history I can claim were my idea, and I certainly did not draw it. But the idea for that costume was my idea. So,
yes,
yeah. So,
and I love you for it. I love you for it. We do have a couple of questions here.
yeah.
Um, I feel like Matt's question can be mixed in possibly with the next question that I was going to ask you. So let's see. Matt says, as a legend yourself, when you were at Marvel and working with some of the greatest writers and artists of all time, how aware were you of just how special they were and the product you were creating was? I'll ask mine separately. It is a little different.
It was weird. I mean, you know, it's one of those things that you get used to. But I remember very early in my career, and I say I had not been. I'm not from capital F fandom. You know, you know, I love comics, and as I described to you, I was, you know, in those first 5 or 7 years of Marvel, you know, I was right there. I was totally entranced. But I've been away, and I certainly, in the days before the internet, I didn't know a lot of the industry gossip and behind the scenes stuff. So when I came to work at Marvel, and say I'd be on the phone with Carmine Infantino, you know, after literally, not literally, but after essentially, you know, 5 minutes as a professional. And Carmine was doing a bunch of, since he was drawing Star Wars, he was doing a lot of stuff for the British department because we went through the Star Wars stuff faster than. So I'm like giving Carmine Infantino instructions on what to draw on a cover or a splash page. And I had no idea the history and that he'd been in charge at DC and that he had, you know, he was his leaving was not that pleasant and how bitter he was, you know, and he just what you know, and he couldn't have been. But I mean, certainly because I knew that name so much from my childhood, and you know, having to have an art correction done and walking into John Romita and asking him to like make a change on a cover drawing. that was mind-boggling. You know, that these people, right? Because to me, they were rock stars, even though,
Mm.
you know, they were in a much narrower context. So I'd say it took me a while to get used to that. Um, but you know, at a certain point, you do then find, you know, since one's job, especially, you know, an editorial, especially as an assistant, involves getting materials out on time. You know, sort of my shtick about it is, "Hello, living legend of my childhood. I can't believe I'm speaking to you. It's such an honor. You've changed my life so much. Now, where are the fucking pages?" Right? I mean, it's you know, right? At a certain point, that disconnect, you become used to it, and a little more polite than that, you know. But
Yeah, yeah.
but I mean, there's a certain level where you're talking to your childhood idol, somebody who you literally wanted to grow up to be, and you're telling them, "Get the damn pages in," because
Hurry up! I respect you, but hurry up. um,
it's a very so it's uh yeah, that was definitely a thing I had to get used to. Uh, but then you do, because that's who you're working with every day. And then a lot of it depends on their own sense of self. Because
mm,
some people have giant egos
mm.
and they can be abusive with it, and other people who are just as famous or accomplished are so nice and so considerate. You know, it's really it could turn your head around several hundred degrees. You know.
Well, hey, look, from a guy that's running a smallish YouTube channel that gets to reach out to people like yourself, there is many different reactions and answers that I will get, and to have somebody of your caliber be as straight up and as nice as you were, it's really, they say don't meet your heroes, because they can be really a letdown. But in this case, I've got to tell you, I'm very, very impressed, mate. And I'm very, very, you make sure, I'll tell you after the show what experience that I've had.
Okay, I can't wait.
And it's,
And
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 it's
and
probably
we,
something,
and we still have like some time to go, so I could still disappoint you. You could turn out to be a crashing disappointment, and send you to therapy or something. You know.
look at this. We also have a new member joining the For Lifers. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that. For that, we're going to give you the super chat video, buddy.
Thanks for the super chat, baby! Yeah! Burgers and ribs!
That's right, burgers and ribs all the
So
way.
there you go. Now
He's also got a question here. Jeff, let's see. Where's your question, mate? Here we go. No, that's Claudia. Apologies. Sorry, the screen is so small. One sec. Here we go. Who are some of your favorite writers and artists to work with?
Well, I mean, one that comes to mind is Sal Buscema, who just passed away a few days ago. Uh, Sal was great. Sal was underappreciated, and what was amazing about Sal was he never stopped trying to get better. You know, if you look at the work he was doing on Spider-Man in the 90s after he'd been in the business 25 years, this is a guy who was consciously trying to up his game and did up his game. And so Sal was great to work with. Tom DeFalco, J.M. DeMatteis, are close friends to this day. Howard Mackey, Ron Friends, Mark Bagley. I'm sure I'm leaving
Wow,
people. These
that's
were
some names.
these were people. It was who it was who I had a good chemistry with. you're not going to have good chemistry with everybody. There's just some very talented people whose work I admired, but I kind of dreaded getting on the phone with them. It's just because you knew that anything you no matter what you chose to speak to them about, there'd be some gotcha kind of moment. There'd be some crazy shit that you have to. It's like, or whatever, So I mean, but that's what I found, for better or worse, is the few jobs I ever had outside comics. Same thing, I mean, just there are people you're going to get along with. There are people who feel it necessary to recreate their childhood traumas with you. So, but those people I mentioned were some of my favorites. Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned Sal, because being such a huge lover of the Clone Saga, I've instantly got this page that he did in Spectacular Spider-Man where Peter Parker, or was probably one of the clones actually, is on his knees, hands and knees, screaming at the sky, and the rain just pouring down on him. And that always was just so much to me as a kid. Like, it was so emotional, and I just loved it. And you're right, Sal was very underrated, because the conversations that I would have about who are the greatest artists of all times, when I would mention names like JR or Sal Buscema, people would give me a bit of crap for that. And I'd be like, well, these are the guys that I grew up with, and these are the guys that I loved.
And a lot of it depended. Well, I mean, some of them are just great, but I mean, say Sal in particular seemed to hit it off with J.M. DeMatteis. They seem to, and of course Ron Frenz and Tom DeFalco, who have been a team. I first put them together as a writer-artist team, but I think Tom had been Ron's editor before, so they knew each other. But I mean, those guys, it's like Lee and Kirby. You sort of mention their names, in one breath, as if they're one creature.
Yeah.
So when something like that, like I said, when something like that happens, it's nice to be a part of, and a pleasure, a pleasure to be able to say to somebody, "Oh, hey, did you think of maybe doing this way?" And having them be capable of going either, "Oh, a good idea, thank you," or "No, I don't like that. I'd rather do something else," as opposed to becoming hysterical and freaking out and "How dare you?" It's a weird, it's a strange thing, and there are, you just don't know. I guess that's why there are different editors, different personalities, because people just have different ways they interact and respond to, probably going back to like how how your parents talked to you when you were a kid or something. Anyway, so those are some of my, some people I enjoyed working with.
Okay. Well, going from the reality to the fictional now, what is the strongest personal connection that you feel you have with any Marvel character? I'm going to guess it's probably Spider-Man, but you could say Darkhawk for all I know.
As a kid, I liked Spider-Man, but it wasn't until I started working professionally as the Spider-Man editor that I really came to appreciate the character. My father had two things in common with Tony Stark. He had a mustache like Tony Stark, and he had a heart. Huh?
Playboy.
What do you mean? Oh, well, yes, that's the other one, of course. Yes, that's the other thing. And he had a heart condition like Tony Stark. So I lived from very early childhood with this consciousness. Yeah, my father had his first heart attack when I was a little kid, and then so I really identified with Tony Stark as having those heart troubles. So in some way, that was my most intense connection with the comic book character in my childhood. I love Daredevil for some reason. I love the way Romita Sr. drew him. I love the way Gene Colan. I just love the character. I loved the Fantastic. A lot of people a lot of people within a year or two of my age worked at Marvel when I did, and I think it's no accident. I think it's because a lot of them probably had a similar experience that I had with discovering Fantastic Four. So although Fantastic Four is almost a footnote, spoiler alert, I did not like the movie at all. Um, but Fantastic Four, those first 100, certainly a lot of people say, oh, it hit its stride with issue 40, and that it hit its stride with issue 1. Fantastic Four was to me the great, what somebody more clever than me referred to it as like the great American novel in comic book form. Those issues, whether Stan and Jack loved each other, hated each other, who did what, I don't know. Something made those Fantastic Four, the Thing character. I think I related to the Thing was very much like my father, built sort of like my dad, and darkly wisecracking and very pessimistic, but kind of with a heart of gold and all that. That comic so changed the way I saw comics, and I could not, and then so that was great, and then when Steranko showed up on Agent of Shield, that was, when you'd sort of, it's like, I mean, Marvel in those, those from 1961 to like certainly 1968, and as a child, that's like more than half my life, right?
Yeah.
Marvel, that period was so special and so, boundary changing and weird, and the thing, I mean, it's funny. What comics of that era had, including the DC comics, a lot of words. And when you have your child economy, the more words in a comic, and if they're good words, that's even better. But the more words in a comic, the longer it lasts. I mean, that's your 10 or 12 cent investment lasts 20 minutes. That's a pretty good, and you can reread it. That's a good entertainment. But I mean, I say that partly jokingly, but I think, I mean, one of the great things that Stan and then Roy and then, right? If you're watching a Spider-Man movie and Spider-Man punches Doc Ock, that's the action, right? Boom, that's the punch. It takes a quarter of a second.
Mm-hmm.
When you're reading a comic book, Spider-Man winds up. He makes a 45-word speech. I used to think that I was through with this superheroing. I gave up. I hung up my costume. But then you came out and menaced my Aunt May. And now I'm madder than ever. And you're going to be sorry. Right? You can only do that. I can do it in novels also. But otherwise, it's really a comic book where you suspend your disbelief. And you can actually have a character making a 50-word speech in the time between winding up and throwing a punch. And Stan. And the art was so good. The art told the visual story, so that Stan or Roy or whoever could then put in that really cool extra stuff. I mean, the difference between Marvel and DC, one of the differences in when I was a kid, is that you buy a Superman comic and there'd be 3 Superman stories, and they would be plotted so you got a lot of story points. You had like every panel was pretty much a new story point, or maybe every 2. Marvel, sort of, because there's only a finite number of ideas, Marvel would stretch out a plot point and then give you all this characterization and purple prose, and that was really the difference. And I think what appealed to me and a lot of other people, because I mean, just in terms of density of story, DC gave you a much better deal. You have 3 complete Superman stories, but not a whole lot of characterization and not a whole lot of, purple prose giving you, a vibe, if you will. So that's one of the great things about comics, that even the highest budget movie you can't replicate. What was the question? I don't even know what the question was. What am I?
I think it was the ones that you liked working with the most.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, it is a
favorite
question.
writers or artists to work with.
Okay, but I think somebody from the audience asked a different. Anyway, whatever. Okay.
Oh, hang on. Yeah, we've got a few questions here, and
Okay.
actually, now that we're here, because we're nearly up to an hour, and most people only like to be on for about an hour, and I'm still on the first page of questions.
Well,
So, how much time do you have, Danny?
we started late. Let's say another half hour.
Okay, half. Well, then we need to move on then, because we have so much more to talk about. I've got Life Inside Marvel. I've got the collab.
It's so hard for me to get me to talk about myself. Possibly. I'm sorry. Go
on. If we've got another half an hour, let's shift gears then a bit. I apologise for skipping some questions there, peoples, but that's how the cookie crumbles.
You need 45 minutes.
All right. Well, we'll go with Jeff. Because Jeff has just been a member, we'll get another one of his questions. And Jeff, by the way, if you look me up on Instagram, we will add you to the For Lifers Aussieverse chat. Todd McFarlane tells of how he wouldn't let anyone outwork him. Did you see this manifest while working with him?
Well, I should say that I did not work that much with Todd.
I was going to say, I didn't think you did. Yeah.
Jim Salicrup did. I had two different periods as Spider-Man editor, and in the 80s and then in the 90s. So I'm actually the guy that Todd quit under. I edited one issue, and that was when he decided that he was going to start his own company. So I have a very good relationship with Todd, but there were things involved with the whole Marvel structure, the way Marvel worked, including keeping all the money. I mean, it's funny. These guys, the Image guys, became able to afford to start Image because they made so much in royalties from Marvel. But the fact is, Marvel owned the characters. So Todd, the only comic of Todd's I edited was that issue, that his final Spider-Man issue. What I liked was he and I had disagreements, but he was always professional about it. It never became personal.
That's good.
And like I said, to this day, if I need a favor from him, can you do an interview? Can you do a podcast? Can I get a quote? Whatever. And I appreciate that because, I know people much less talented and much less hardworking who are not so magnanimous. He is incredibly hardworking. I've seen. I'll tell you a story, which I years ago there was a convention in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest of America, and Image had started, but they were still trying to get Marvel artists to come over, and I was there sitting with this particular artist who was still who was with Marvel, and Todd invited us to his house for dinner. Todd, had been on a track to becoming a professional baseball player, but then he was injured and that didn't happen. Todd came back from playing a doubleheader. That's 2 9-inning baseball games. That's 5 to 6 hours of baseball out in the sun. He came home. He cooked us dinner. And then me and him and this artist sat talking for probably about 3 or 4 more hours. It was probably like 2 in the morning in the middle of a convention. And me and the artist were kind of oozing out of our seats with fatigue, and Todd was still going. All on natural Todd energy, no substances involved. And that's typical of Todd. I mean, so he was energetic, focused, and really hardworking. There was I used to be involved with the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art in New York, and there was a Todd show, a Todd exhibition, and he had one particular display case devoted just to the hundreds of rejection letters he'd gotten over the years.
Oh wow!
So yeah, the guy, and look, I mean, look what he does. He has the publishing company, the toy company. It's really, it is. Yeah, I'd say he's one of the, if not the hardest working person in comics I've come across.
Wow. Okay. Okay. That's cool to know.
Yeah.
Switching gears now,
Yes.
we're going to be going from comics to your writing work. Before we do that, though, we do want to make sure that everybody does realize that they can go to dannyfingeroth.com and they can sign up to his newsletter. We can check out his own website right
Well,
here. Welcome to Danny Fingeroth.
let's not get people over. There's no newsletter. The newsletter is a good idea, but you can sign. The best place to find me is Facebook. I'm old. Facebook is,
You sound exactly like me.
yeah.
I say that to people too. Facebook. There's too many platforms now.
I know. Well, I'm on a lot of platforms, but the only one I come close to being on regularly is Facebook.
Yeah. Well, as we mentioned, this is going to be a little bit different now because I had a choice, right, of getting your Stan Lee book or the Many Faces of Oswald's Assassination.
You could have bought them both. Why was it?
I could have bought them both, yes. But hey, I wanted to get the hardcover of this, and next pay I'll be getting the Stan Lee book. Don't worry. But this one really, really fascinated me because I've always been, I'm not going to put labels like historian and things like that, but there are certain parts of history that have always fascinated me. And one of them is around this time, the whole Lee Harvey Oswald. It's really, really fascinating. So please tell everybody about this book and where they can find it now.
Okay. It's called Jack Ruby, The Many Faces of Oswald's Assassin. And it is a book. All right, my specialty has become, as you may have figured out, or maybe not, quirky, oddball, interesting Jewish Americans. And one of them is Stan Lee. And I mean, that's, and then I wrote that book. I wrote a book called Disguised as Clark Kent, Jews, Comics, and Creation of the Superhero. And about 12, 13 years ago, maybe more, I thought I wanted to try doing a nonfiction graphic novel. And I thought maybe since it was coming up on then the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination, I bet there's a lot of graphic novels. Turned out, I did a Google search and turned out nobody had announced they were doing a graphic novel. It turned out that Dan Mishkin and I forget the artist's name, did one about the Warren Commission report. Dan Mishkin, it'll come to me. But that hadn't been announced. So I thought, well, let me try to come up with something on the Kennedy assassination. And then the more, I was never obsessive about it. It was too big for me. I couldn't deal with all the different 10 million conspiracy theories. Started reading about it, and just that Jack Ruby just jumped out at me as this really oddball Jewish guy who just inserted himself into history. And the more I researched, then I found out, the movie Weekend at Bernie's?
Yep.
The star of that, Jonathan Silverman.
Yes.
His father was a rabbi named Hillel Silverman. He was the rabbi.
Oh.
He was Jack Ruby's rabbi in Dallas.
Right. Okay.
And I was able to get a hold of the guy. He just died a few years ago at age 99. And I got a hold of him. I interviewed him, and he said, at this point, he said, I'm almost 90. I can't see. I'm not writing my book anymore. Would you like to see my notes from when I visited Jack in prison every other day for 4 months?
Wow.
I said, yeah, okay. I wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
So the guy sends me his notes. I said, but make me a photocopy, make me scan it, a photocopy. I don't want the responsibility. But of course, he was 90 years old. And 2 days later, I get a FedEx package with the guy's notes from 1963 with the rusty paper clips on them. So I scanned them right away because right away you think, be a good idea for me to have original documents about the Kennedy assassination in my house, you know?
Yeah.
So I mailed them, and it turned out they were gold. They were really, you know, I didn't realize. Anyway, so I wrote. I was working with an artist named Rick Geary, who you may know does a lot of true murder stuff, and
No.
and a packager and an editor named Howard Zimmerman, who I'd worked with at Byron Price Multimedia, which I went after I left Marvel. And
Okay.
we put together a sample. I wrote like several drafts of a 200-page comic book script, and we have sample pages. And we couldn't, a lot of editors and publishers liked it, but they wouldn't, if you pardon the expression, pull the trigger to buy it. So they, we couldn't sell it. I'm a writer. I would, I could be negotiable, but Rick Geary would need like 2 years to draw this thing, and nobody would give us an advance big enough. So I put it on the back burner, and then kind of forgot about it after trying to sell it for a long time. And then it was coming up on the 60th anniversary, and by that time I'd written the 2 books about comics and then the Stan Lee biography. And I said to my agent, I think we could sell that old Jack Ruby project of mine as a prose biography now that I have some credibility from the Stan book. And he did. And so the Chicago Review Press bought it. And then I had to do a lot more research. And, I spoke to, and if people don't know, Jack Ruby is the guy in the famous picture shooting Lee Harvey Oswald, changing history, on live, the first murder on live TV, and, the reverberations from that are still being felt today, to say the least. So I spoke to Ruby's niece and nephew, who hadn't spoken a lot, certainly not under their own names before. Imagine you're 12 years old, you live in Dallas, your name is Ruby, and you've been bragging to all your friends that your uncle owns a strip club because you're 12 years old, and what else, you're not going to, you've been bragging, and then suddenly your crazy uncle, or your crazy cousin or your crazy brother shows up on TV and changes history, So I got the point of view because I figured I'm not solving the JFK assassination. I may be somewhat intelligent, but I'm not smart enough. There's many people who've spent decades literally trying to figure that out. I'm not the guy. But I could shed some light on this guy who's neglected by history for numerous reasons. And at least give some voice to who he was, what might have motivated him. I'm fairly agnostic about what theory. I try to give the flavor of his life and life in Dallas at the time. It's a story of Jack Ruby, who Jack Kirby drew a story about for Esquire magazine.
Oh, okay.
Which you can find online if you look for it. There's a lot of, aside from just being an interesting story, because Ruby was in show business, he didn't just have the strip clubs. And the strip club was not just a strip club, it was a nightclub, but he also had country western clubs. He had a movie. So Jack Ruby, the last person to give Hank Williams regular work, the country western star.
Mm-hmm.
And then and so there's all these bold name 50s and 60s celebrities attached to the Jack Ruby story, and all sorts of. I think he was a really right? Nobody is, a lot of people are famous for one moment in history, but obviously they have a life before and after it. And Ruby was no exception. My best story, and this, you may be too young, but maybe you're not. Do you remember a television show called Welcome Back, Kotter?
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, indeed.
Okay, well, it starred and was created by this guy named Gabe Kaplan. Sort of had the bushy kind of Jewish afro and a mustache, and that show. And it's a show where John Travolta became famous as.
Oh, did he ever? Yeah.
Yeah. So that was popular, at least in America and maybe in Australia, in the mid and late 70s. But then Gabe Kaplan kind of dropped out of sight. He sometimes performs. He did a one-man Groucho Marx show, but he spent most of his time in the ensuing years as a professional gambler. And I heard him, a few years ago on Gilbert Gottfried, the late Gilbert Gottfried's podcast, the comedian Gilbert Gottfried. And he tells this story about auditioning for Jack Ruby. And it's a really hilarious story. And I won't try to tell it, but it's just, and of course, I transcribed it and I put it in my book. I, give everybody, I give Kaplan credit, I give Gilbert credit, I give the producer Frank Santopadre, so I've dotted all my I's and crossed all my T's. And then I'm giving a presentation at the Dallas Jewish Historical Society on the 60th anniversary.
Wow.
And in the audience, it's an audience full of old Jews because they're all people in their 60s, 70s, 80s whose parents and aunts and uncles all knew Jack Ruby, and I'm telling them about Jack Ruby in that room.
Wow.
And I have up on my PowerPoint, and I'm in Dallas. I'm not in New York or LA. I'm not in a showbiz capital. And as part of my PowerPoint and my talk, I have a picture of Gabe Kaplan from the Welcome Back Kotter days, and I tell his story about auditioning for Jack Ruby. Nobody in the audience says, you're full of crap, you don't know what you're talking about. And everybody's very polite. Nobody says I don't get down, which was good. I go to sit down to sign books, and a guy, one of the old Jews, comes up, and I say, who should I make the book out to? He says, make it out to Gabe. And then a light bulb goes off, and I go, you're Gabe Kaplan. And you were just sitting in the audience in Dallas, for one reason that I can think of, while I told your story and showed your picture.
How did that make you feel?
It was surreal.
Yeah.
And then he said, yeah, what are you doing for dinner? And so I ended up having dinner with Gabe Kaplan. And he gave me a blurb for the paperback.
Wow.
It turns out that he lives in Dallas part-time for whatever reason. And a friend of his said, hey, somebody's giving a talk about your pal Jack Ruby. And that's probably my best and most surreal story. But Ruby's life intersected with a lot of showbiz people and a lot of sport. I mean, it's just weird. But he was a guy who went out of his way to network and to know people, and he wanted to be in show business himself.
Okay.
And there have been biographies of him, but there hadn't been one for years. And I can't say I'm the only one who had the rabbi's notes, but I think I made more use of them than anybody did.
Okay.
And and I sort of anyway. So I people seem to like it. But it was my first attempt to write something that was not about the world of comics or graphic novels, and it seems it seemed to have worked. I can't say it was a runaway bestseller, but I got it's funny. I got a lot of blurbs from a lot of interesting people. Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, it's like, and so right now I'm sort of pursuing, ideas for books about other aspects of popular culture as well as stuff about comics. I've recently become involved with a place called the Borscht Belt Museum. I don't know if the Borscht Belt, does that ring a bell? The Borscht Belt was the Jewish hotels in the Catskill Mountains.
Oh, okay.
Comedians like Mel Brooks got their start, Rodney Dangerfield. And so it's sort of a whole subculture that I'm interested in. And my dad was involved as a cantor during the high holidays. If I have a narrow kind of fame as a famous comic book editor, my father was a famous cantor, which means nobody heard of him either, except people who cared about that stuff. Anyway, so it's this, but everything I get to do, right? I've spoken at the Bob Dylan Festival. I've spoken at the Marx Brothers Festival. Usually it's because somebody in the organization knows my work from comics,
Yeah, I was going to
That's
say.
always my foot in the door. And then I try not to embarrass myself with these other areas of interest.
It must have been a little, it's regardless of how much confidence or faith you had in yourself, it must have been a little daunting taking on this task and wanting it to be successful.
Well, I am glad that I didn't the problem with the Kennedy assassination is not that there's not enough information. The problem is that there's so much information
Yeah.
that you can construct any narrative you want out of it. So I'm glad I didn't take on Oswald. That would have been a much more difficult. The thing about Ruby, I mean, look, the thing about Ruby, about Stanley, I'm also very involved, by the way, to just give a plug. I'm involved with the Will Eisner Foundation. I've been running for the past 15 years something called Will Eisner Week, an annual celebration worldwide of Will Eisner. If you'd like to put on an event, it's not, and it's always around Eisner's March 6th birthday. He was born March 6th, 1917. Eisner was an innovator in comics, both in the Golden Age and in one of the founders of the current graphic novel movement. So I have to say, the founders of comics and Jack Ruby, and in their way, the Marx Brothers, they all could be my relatives. They all could be my aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, firstborn American children of Jewish, Eastern European Jewish immigrants, So, I mean, Ruby is from, I often call the Jack Ruby story a greatest generation story gone horribly wrong, But I mean, I think that's my kind of comfort zone, and my entry into it is, Jack Ruby really could have been my, and I mean, I don't think it's strictly a Jewish thing, but it's obviously it has a little resonance for me. Jack Ruby could be your craziest relative, unless you yourself are your craziest relative. But your craziest relative steps into the TV screen and kills Lee Harvey Oswald, right? And that's part of the story, because he was one of 8 siblings, one crazier than the next.
Yeah.
But imagine you're sitting there, and that's all there was to watch that weekend.
Yeah.
And you look and you go, is that Jack? It's like, oh God, Jack, what have you done now?
Oh.
That's what happened. His crazy family pooled their resources. They bankrupted themselves. He had one especially successful sibling who was a dry cleaning mogul in Michigan, and so it's very much a family story. I was saying about, So I mean, like I said, I'm not solving the mysteries of the Kennedy assassination, but if I can tell a story about what happens when your craziest cousin or your craziest sibling changes history, and you have to then arrange, and his family went through so many lawyers, just
I can imagine.
It's just an incredible story. Anyway, so that's the book. So it's a fascinating, but you're right, and that's why I thought I realized very early on, because everybody thinks, "Oh, I'll find the one thing that'll say." No, you won't. At least not me. So that's the good news and the bad news, that there are so many books about the Kennedy assassination, but not that many about Ruby, and not for a long time. Although weirdly enough, and this is a classic thing that happens to authors all the time, I think, as I was working on it, a book came out about the Ruby trial, and by 2 guys, I forget their names, not on purpose, but 2 guys who were like legal experts for network television, and my heart sank. I just went, "Oh my God!" And then, and then it turned out their book was really strictly focused on the trial, which was the biggest circus trial until the Chicago 7 trial, Ruby trial. But their book was focused on that, and mine was certainly deals with the trial, but a lot of the life up until that most famous moment. So, but that always happens. You write a book, or you're working on a book, and then you hear about somebody else working on it, and
you make Armageddon the movie, and then Deep Impact comes out.
Let's say again.
You make the Armageddon movie, and then Deep Impact comes out.
Well, I mean, I think there's just stuff that's in the air, and people, and right, and you just have to go, well, I mean, there was one time there was a book I was writing on that I was planning to write, and then I found out somebody else was writing it, and I was kind of relieved, because it was, huh?
Oh, which book was that?
It was a biography of Jerry Rubin. You know who that was?
Okay. Yep.
Okay, and I'd seen that that there were a lot. Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin were like the Yippies, and they were from the '60s and '70s, and um, they were very interesting cultural figures. And there had been like half a dozen books about Abby Hoffman, but nobody had written a biography of Jerry Rubin, which I thought, well, that's not fair. And then, of course, it turned out nobody had written a book about Jerry Rubin because there was no interest in a book about Jerry Rubin. But I was still determined. I partnered up with a guy named Mike Gold, the editor and publisher of First Comics, and then at DC. So, and Mike had been the publicity director for the Chicago Seven in his pre-comics lifetime. And so we were going to write this book, and then we heard that somebody else had gotten a head start. And a guy named Pat Thomas, and he wrote a book that's terrific that Fantagraphics published called Did It. Because Rubin had written a book called Do It. So this book called Did It.
Gotcha.
And he, he knocked himself out, did a lot of research. It's very lushly illustrated. There's some quotes from Danny Fingeroth in the book. And but I've never inquired, but I can't imagine it made a lot of money, even though I'm glad the book exists. But therefore, I'm glad somebody else wrote it, because it was a shit ton of work, and I just don't think it would have, probably, I hope I'm wrong, but my sense is that it was not like a big seller.
Well, a personal question that I want to ask you is, as human beings, I think we all like the thought of being immortal and having our stance in the world and something that we have created and living the test of time. Some people, like myself, I've turned around and said, I would love to just make one comic just once, just to say that I've done it, I've got my name on it, and it lives forever, right? Being yourself, how does it make you feel not only accomplishing that goal, because you have, whether it be your books or comics or whatever, your name is now immortalized, but how does it make you feel having, somebody, for example, from Australia reach out to you and be like, hey, Mr. Fingeroth, I've known you about your work, and it's got to make you feel like you're very accomplished is I guess the point that I'm trying to make. Is that, am I right in saying that, or do you feel like there's still more that you've got to do? How do you feel about it?
Well, don't forget, right? I mean, a lot of the names we mentioned. I mean, and I guess I'm living in somewhat rarefied air, but I'm comparing myself all the time to Todd McFarlane and Tom DeFalco and Walter Isaacson, or I mean, so I get what you're saying, and I do have to sometimes stop and remember that. But there's always somebody who you see is better or making more money or more popular. I'd say so thank you for saying that, because I appreciate that more than you know, because and I think creative people like this all no matter what you've done, there's always going to be somebody who's done more, or done it better, or more famous, or richer, or whatever. The flip side, which you have to get used to, or maybe you don't, is people who maybe are not so fond of you or your work, and and on social media they can they somehow seem to have, right, they're never like, oh, pardon me, good sir, but I have a difference of opinion that I wanted to discuss. It's always like,
oh, Danny,
it's always, if I say something positive about Stan, it means I must hate Jack. And not only must they hate Jack, but they must make their life's purpose proving what a fraud and a malevolent person I am.
oh wow, okay,
That's the flip side.
yeah.
And of course, with Google, if I'm just Googling something about, not even about myself, if I'm Googling like a relative, with this weird name I have. So it's, and I will tell you, I have had more hostile, there's people angrier about who did what in the Lee and Kirby situation than about who killed JFK. I mean, You know, I'll tell you one time somebody wanted me to give a talk last year, maybe 2 years ago. They wanted to give a talk about Stan Lee, and I said, I'm happy to do it. But my new book is Jack Ruby, so I want to talk about them both. So they said, fine.
Yeah.
So I do have a talk called Stanley and Jack Ruby, and my rationale is that they both had big years in 1963. You know, by the way, should I get a copy of this? Oh, you use the Stanley book in the promotion, so you can put that cover of that book up somewhere, right?
Oh yeah, yes I can actually. While I get that, we've got one question from Matt here.
And one other footnote, although I have a lot of footnotes. I have done my own audiobook reading for the Jack Ruby book, the Stan Lee book, and also for Superman on the Couch in Disguise as Clark Kent. So if you like hearing this, imagine 14 hours of it in your headphones. I'm sorry. And we haven't even talked about the clone.
Oh, mate, don't even. I know. I can't believe how well this has been. An hour and 20 minutes, and there's so much more to talk about.
We can do a part two. If you want, we can do a part two. But what's the question? Somebody had a question.
The question from Matt was, what was the biggest hurdle you found when you're teaching the students, and what's your response and lesson to help them overcome it?
Wow. Somebody did a deep dive.
Here we go.
I would say, well, I mean, that's a, oh, there we go. Thank you. Yes, that's a book, A Marvelous Life.
You're welcome.
And I have a great blurb from Jules Pfeiffer, which is my favorite blurb.
99 cents. I can get the audio book.
Yeah. Well, but
I saw the $60 hardcover, which is why I had to choose between one this week. I might get the audio book, Danny.
Yeah, well, you have to join Audible to get that, I think.
Oh, go join Audible to get the book.
Well, I mean, I think the thing that people, very often somebody would come into the class and they had an idea for how they would fix the entire Marvel or DC universe. And I mean, I get where that impulse comes from, but
we need more Batman.
Not only do we need more Batman, but we need to explain everything that they got wrong in Batman for the past 60 years. They would bring in this, I mean, my assignment was always write a 5-page story, but there would always be somebody or more who'd want to do this, incredibly complicated, elaborate thing, and sometimes to convince people that maybe they should start with writing a 5-page story. Everybody was good-hearted. That's a challenge. People don't often. What I always would have people do, I have them do full script. At Marvel, not so much anymore, but in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s, people would often do plot first, and then the art would get drawn that he come put the dialogue in.
Yeah.
And I would have people letter in. I said, I'm not asking you to be an artist. It's a writing class, but do stick figure thumbnails, print size, and then write in the dialogue. So you get a sense of how much dialogue fits in. And the other thing that people do, and these are all, is when you're writing a script, either whether it's a plot, but I've had people write scripts, and they're very good writers, but they haven't written comics before. And they'll put a lot of witty, intelligent, insightful stuff in the panel description. And I'll go, well, that's great. I enjoyed that. And if you're printing a book of your scripts, fine. And it's great that you can get across the tone and the feeling of what you want to the artist. But that clever, witty stuff in your panel description is not going to be in the artwork. It's not going to be in the finished comic. And sometimes that's a conceptual leap for people. So those are some of the. But yeah, I think people just figure they've had a story or a bunch of stories in their mind for their whole life, and they're taking this course and they're going to fit everything in. What I'd love to, what I tried to do, because I've taught in different venues and I've taught online, I'm giving a course through something called 70 Faces Media, like a history of Jewish comics, or based on my book Disguised as Clark Kent. I'll be doing that online starting next, I think, in March.
Oh,
I can
okay.
send you information once they print the promotional information. I can send you that.
Yeah, great.
But it's I lost my train. So how do teaching? Back up the tape. What was I starting to say? doesn't, doesn't matter. Yeah.
Hey, look, my father would have loved to sit down with you and have a conversation. The only regret that I have with this video is that it was a year too late. But
Well,
you
I'm
know,
sorry.
he was he was always teaching me about all the Jewish famous people.
I don't want to bring. I'm sorry. Let me just get. I taught. I would love to teach a comic book editing course. I taught it online once, and because that's really a skill set that's so complicated, and to try to streamline that and teach people the basic uh, concepts behind editing comic. Like I said, it's something that people don't even really understand what a comic book edit. I mean, people don't even for books, people just think an editor is a proofreader. People don't really understand, and it's because every editor and every editorial relationship with creative person is different.
Hmm.
But I'd like to do that again. Maybe find some better way to promote it. It just because I think that's information, and my sense is that the companies, that nobody's teaching people how to edit. There's no apprentice system really, like there was. I could be wrong, but and I have, me and a lot of other people have this accumulated esoteric knowledge. Yet that's very, as long as they're going to keep putting out comics, there's you know feel free to break the rules or not obey the rules or make your own. But you should at least know what people have been doing, since the past
Yeah.
100 years editing comic books. Do you want to do a part two, or do you want to try to cram some clone stuff into 20 minutes?
Oh well, I'm more than happy to do a part two if you want to do one. But yeah, I mean, I've still got a few things for those that didn't get the titles of the books. Take a look at the description. You will see where you can buy all of Danny's books. Man, okay, so I've skipped to the end of my questions, so in the closing ones. Okay, um, uh, what Marvel stories or moments are you most proud of being a part of?
Huh. I really love the DeFalco and Friends run on Spider-Man. I thought that they both understood and appreciated the character in a profound way.
The
Other
friends
people,
and enemies.
Ron Friends and Tom DeFalco writer. I mean, they really were co-plotting. DeFalco and
Yeah.
Friends. It was in the 80s.
Okay.
And then there's Spider Girl also, but I didn't work on that. I just thought that they brought uh, an understanding of who Peter Parker was. That I think Stan and Steve had it, and Stan and Romita.
I
Roger,
loved Spot Girl.
Roger Stern had. There's certainly people who had it, but I thought that somehow Tom and Ron connected with that. I wrote a graphic novel called Death Trap the Vault that I thought was pretty good, that I'm proud of.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I didn't know you wrote that. Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, that was one of my easiest sells to an editor. Sometimes
That
you
was
have
a
to,
Venom issue.
and then, I loved J.M. DeMatteis's. I never know. I've known him for like 40 years. I still am not sure how to pronounce his name. I think, but J.M. DeMatteis, he and Sal Buscema did the Child Within story arc, which I thought was
Oh.
outstanding.
Oh.
And I know I'm leaving out a lot of people. I mean,
Hard question.
I think the Stan Lee book. Some people think. Some people don't think I was hard enough on Stan. There are other books that are very hard on Stan. I don't think mine was a hagiography. I think mine gave a look at Stan and gave a look at comic book. Since Stan lived through so much of comic book history, of superhero comic book history anyway. That I think that book, there are things I might do differently, but I think overall it was sort of an. I thought as someone who had jobs over the years that were in some ways similar to Stan's. I'm not saying obviously there was only one Stan Lee, but as someone who had worked in editorial and comic book companies, large at Marvel and then small after I left Marvel, I think I had an understanding of what Stan and that whole era and generation of creators were about, that even the best biographer or historian wouldn't have. Does that make me too close to it? Am I too inclined to be forgiving? I don't know. But I think I do know how the sausage is made in a way that somebody else wouldn't. So yeah, I'm proud of those things.
That must be something very, very. I'd be very proud of that myself. Is what I'm trying to say.
Well, thank you.
That's amazing. What if I'm trying to ask you these quickly as well? So if they're too long, we'll leave these for part 2. But what still excites you about storytelling today?
Wow. This is going to be a funny answer. I'm excited when I discover a stand-up comedian I haven't heard of, and they're really funny. I mean, a good stand-up comedian is telling a story.
Yeah.
There's a guy, and it's always the riskiest thing because comedy is, even more so than storytelling. Comedy is so personal that there can be somebody you think is hilariously funny, and you tell like an old friend, and they go, "That's not funny," So, but a good comedian, Mark Maron, say, but I mean, I can't say obviously, Mark, everybody knows who Mark Maron. That's my great pleasure somehow, and narratively, I find, maybe I'm just becoming a curmudgeon. I find most movies I go to see, I'm sort of impatient with, maybe because maybe because I spent so much of my life studying and working with story structure, and characterization that, I feel like I'm a big party pooper when I go to the movies these days.
Yeah.
As we were talking about the Fantastic Four movie, I didn't just come away cold. I loathed that movie.
Oh wow!
Okay. I came away like the Superman movie was highly flawed, but the Superman movie, I was like this, right? I just had to stop. The Fantastic Four movie, I was like this the whole time, and yet people love that, So I mean, I was a film student. Like I said, I spent my entire life dissecting stories, but I still think a good story can hit me. I guess because I've been writing biography, I've been reading a lot of biographies. There are still some biographies that I really like. I know you're going to ask me to name one. That'll be for part 2. There's some very enjoyable biographies I've read. But somehow movies, I don't know if I'm just of a different generation or different era, but I don't know, they're just movies that everybody loves. They get nominated for awards, and I just go, I don't know. I like Robert Downey's documentary about his father a lot. I'm sure the second we hang up, I'll think of 10 other. I think what I find myself doing is watching a lot of YouTubes of comedians interviewing other comedians.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So maybe that's part of my whole analytic turn. And again, as an editor, you're literally sitting there analyzing the hell out of stories. Well, Matt, now the pressure's on. At H. What question was I answering about? What excites me?
What still excites you about storytelling?
Yeah, I think it's biography. I think it's comedians. There's got to be some movie I loved, and I mean, I feel like it's a failing in me that I'm going to the movies and coming out of it going, well, that was 2 hours I'll never get back. You know, I mean, I just.
Hey, I don't even know how old I am anymore. I lost count after 40. But once I hit 40, I don't know what happened, but I'm understanding what you're saying, because you see movies now. Did you see the new Red Sonja, for example?
No. Yeah.
Oh, that was absolutely horrible. And
I'll tell you what I liked, although I thought it was padded out, was a show, and maybe because it's about a presidential assassination. It's called Death by Lightning. It's a 4-part Netflix show about the Garfield assassination.
Oh, okay. No, I haven't seen that.
The thing I didn't like about it, and I think this is just the sign of the times, I think it would have been a terrific 2-hour movie, but because of the nature of streaming, they padded it out to 4 1-hour episodes, and to me it felt padded out. But I thought it was a really, very, I mean, everybody talks about the Kennedy assassination and the Lincoln assassination, but there were 2 other American presidents assassinated, Garfield and McKinley, that are never talked about. So that was probably my favorite. The thing I was most excited about in terms of storytelling recently was Death by Lightning.
Okay. Thanks for letting me know. I'll have to check that out myself. Now, the last 2 really quick questions, Danny, and we'll let you go. One of them we'll ask right now. We'll play our sponsor video, and then I'll ask you the last one. Sharif, is there a general... Sharif, you didn't make it to today's show, so we're not answering your question. That's what happens when you're lazy. We're going to skip him. He's one of the Aussieverse guys here. So, Danny, where should audiences keep an eye on you to see what's coming up next? Where should they see?
My Facebook, Danny Fingeroth, on Facebook is probably the best bet. I have a website, but I can't. It grows tumbleweed, so it's reasonably up to date, but probably my Facebook page is where I will announce things. But if you want to know background about me or links to my books and stuff, then DannyFingeroth.com, is certainly a good place.
Sharif, hopefully next time we organise it, you can make it and you can ask him yourself. We are now going to have a word from our sponsor, and then we ask Danny the most important question of the night. Ooh, what is that? We'll find out.
Comic Bookaroo, proud sponsors of Aussieverse for all your comic book needs. Graphic novels, hardcovers, omnibuses, single issues. Don't forget to pre-order every Sunday at Comic Bookaroo.
I've got a question. I have a question for you. In your promotion, you refer to omnibuses.
Omnibuys?
I don't know. I sometimes say omnibuy, but that sounds bad. That doesn't sound right either. But omnibuses is a mouthful. That's a lot.
Well, I think the first one that came out was omnibuses, but that just sounds even worse.
Yeah. Sounds like too. Yeah.
I don't know if there's a plural for it, but yes, we are big collected edition fans here.
Yeah, okay. So what's this question that will change my life?
Okay, this is the question that we ask everybody on the show when they leave here. I didn't word you up, Danny, because we had the technical difficulties, so I do apologize. 9 out of 10 times, people get the answer wrong, and then I scream and yell at them, and then it's the end of the show. So if that does happen, I do have to apologize, but either way, please stick around so I can have a quick chat to you after the show. Yeah. Danny, if I was to say to you, what is Aussieverse? What would your answer be, sir?
Is that what this is?
Yeah.
I have no friggin' idea what Aussieverse is.
Okay. Well, that was a very honest answer. I do appreciate that.
What is Aussieverse? Is that...
Aussieverse is and always will be for life. Thank you very much, Danny Fingeroth, for joining us today. It has been an absolute honor. Thank you for being such a gentleman, such a wonderful human being, and so nice online. It's really blown me away. I cannot wait to finish reading this book. We cannot wait to have you back on the show.
That's too much pressure. I have to think of something insulting for next time. But thank you for having me on. Thank you for being so nice, and your questions were great. And thanks for your audience questions too.
Thank you very much. We'll catch you next time.
All right. Take care.